believe we are pretty aware of the fact that without identity, we cannot have dialogue within globalization. We can have monologue maybe, but are we interested in to have monologues? That's my first question. I like making questions more than answering to them, so I will pose at least two main questions. The first question is, why is Venice sinking? Why aren't we able to do something about that? How is it possible? We know that, we talk about that, we even joke on that. Is maybe Venice sinking into the bath tube of her quiet and shallow lagoon? But what's the connection between Venice and Atlantis? We all know that Atlantis sunk because of a sin, the sin of arrogance. So the powerful island ruling a big empire was found to be arrogant, and the gods decided to let her sink into the water. What's the sin of Venice then? Is that an ethical punishment that we are looking at? Do we want to see Venice sinking because of a sin? Well, what I'm trying to squeeze into 15 minutes is my personal idea that, yes, Venice has a sin, the sin of the untamed individuality, of the pure individuality, of the individuality which becomes a sin when it's not able to really dialogue, and which is completely unique. It's personal. Yes, it is. And since nobody cares, I do. As a writer, I always ask myself, and this is my third question, and I hope it's the last one, can writers possibly save Venice from sinking? Writers. I wrote a book in 2004, and the title was, as translated into English, Sinking Venice. The book has been translated into French in 2008. And the reason why I wrote that book is that I narrated in it how Venice saved me from sinking into the stinking waters of my psychic lagoon. So I wrote it as a gift to the city which saved me, and I will be eternally grateful to her because she was able to combine my two main natures, the scholar and the playful child. And thanks to her thaumaturgic touch, she was able to spin everything with a big energy and transform me into a writer with that book. So I'm grateful for that, and I attempted to save her with my book. Of course, I aimed at, I hoped that. But let me tell you all the story from the right beginning. I was 26 years old after I got my PhD, and I didn't know who I was. I didn't feel any calling in my life after all that study, and I had forgotten that as a child I wanted to be a writer. At the same time, I developed a skin disease called eczema. I don't know if you know what it is. It's very it's horrible to see, it's horrible to have, and it covered first my face, then all the body, and my face starts swelling up. And I immediately got the image of an analogy, one of my weird analogies, the ones that usually I have in my mind, between my skin eczema and the seaweeds that cover Venetian palazzi and the moss that starts coming up from the waters. And I was scared by this analogy, and I just stopped thinking about that. Then I started having nightmares obsessively, night after night, of Venice sinking into the waters and taking me with her. And I started being afraid. I traveled. I started traveling obsessively because obsessively is my way of doing things. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to Venice and to Tuscany, to Pisa, where I lived at that time. And I was aware that I had started traveling to Venice exactly the way I used to do with my family as a child. back and forth every weekend there. I grew up in the mountains, in the Dolomites, so can you imagine something more different than the Dolomites and Venice? Well, so I did. I traveled, I took snapshots of Venice, I jotted down plenty of things in my journal, I sketched, I prayed, I sat, I spotted the lagoon, then I went to the churches, to the museums, I lost myself into the mazes of Venice, and I didn't understand why I needed so badly to travel there. But I did perform it. I didn't have any other choice. And then I read as much as possible, also because hiding myself into the libraries was my style of life, and nobody really cares about me having a swelling face or being completely red. So for years, I read and I did research about Venice while not understanding why it was so important for me. Then I started writing, and still I had no idea of what I was doing. At that point, Venice was a part of me, of course, because of all this traveling and thinking and reading and jotting down. And I found myself writing in a very strange, weird way. A few chapters of my would-be book were narration in a childish way, like fairy tales. Some other were philosophical speculation about the destiny of the European city and Mediterranean city. In some other, I was digging big into the big symbol of what Venice had been and could possibly be now and in the future. And all that made a very strange book, which was not a book, actually. And then I thought, well, it is exactly like Venice, which has a lot of everything in it. You can be a child in Venice and lose yourself into the maze. You can be a scholar in Venice and visit all the museums. You can be both. Her symbol is a lion, a winged lion standing up on a column, pointing the sky, reading a book. Isn't it strange enough? And then I realized, I'm Venice. And I tried to publish that book that created a kind of new literary genre, the fantasy essay. This is the way I put the undertitle of it, a fantasy essay. My eczema went away after that, bit by bit, but it went away, as you can see it today. So again, can writers say Venice? I want it so bad that writers are able to say Venice, but I don't know if they can. What I know is they certainly should. Why? Because writers, when they go to Venice, they go there for discovering themselves usually, at least a part of them, a hidden part of them. One for all of them, von Aschenbach, the musician, by Mann, or in the version the version by Visconti, a writer. No, it's the other way around. Anyway, in a recent ballet by von Neumeier is a choreographer. He goes to Venice for discovering his homosexuality, a part of him which was not allowed at all. But I can name Chateaubriand, Madame de Stael, Proust, Rilke, Hesse, Brodsky, Matveyevich, and Paolo Barbaro. All of them, when they enter the maze of Venice, start having the temptation of doing autobiography. They all do autobiography when entering Venice. And while describing her, they are trying to describe themselves, to provide a description of themselves as a city. Proust, when he went to Venice and tried to find a similarity between Venice and Cambrai, found out that actually there is no similarity between the two, because Cambrai is Venice. The same happened to Chateaubriand, who thought that Venice and Vannes were very similar, and then ended up saying something paradoxical, that Vannes was the mother of Venice and that Venice was the mother of Vannes as well. So something really a paradox. Well, all the writers, when enter Venice, they need to find something about themselves. And why? Probably it's because Venice is so unique that it challenged the uniqueness of the individual to come out. That's my idea. And what I like to say the most today is that this is not just of Venice's, because each Mediterranean city has this power. because in the Greek tradition, each Mediterranean city had not a birth certificate, so a bureaucratic piece of paper that said is born, but had a full myth that narrated her birth. So a narration made orally by artists, by poets. And also every single city had family ties around the Mediterranean. They were called syngeneiai. So they were part of a genos, of a family around the Mediterranean. And they also could claim for a genealogy. So they were persons. They were considered as persons with a specific individuality. And Venice is still preserving that uniqueness, which is difficult to be considered into the net of the globalized world. So the city as a person, are we able to not being scared by that? Are we able to understand that each city has her way of being lived? The way each individual has his own way of being, the individual is something you cannot divide even further. It's something that stays there, but it's not something which stays there without effort and pain. The individuality is the possible achievement of a process, of a long process. We need to be able to find out what we are, and the city do the same. And for Venice, the individuality is paradoxical. It's female, it's beautiful, it's falling apart, it's full of color. It has doors that open into the water, and it's learned, it's old, it's fading away, it's both things. We need to accept all that. And writers should be able to accept that the individuality is the core of the communication in the world, because they strive the whole life for finding a voice of them. Oh, I have a voice as a writer. Many of them find out that they have multiple voices in them when writing different books. So the idea is that the city is a person, and the person might be a city as well. So they are connected, deeply connected, also because the challenge of finding your own individuality is as serious as playful. And this is something I believe we have forgotten in our globalized city, to be playful. And if we think deeper, the word person, at least in the Latin persona, is the living creature, but it's also the mosque. So it provides the idea that the city is as well a living creature, an organism. In fact, Venice is dying, so we can call for the metaphor of a living being, and a work of art. A mosque is a work of art. So the city is both, in my opinion. Exactly like a work of art is not just something created, but something generated by the artist. Aristotle in the Poetic says that art, mimesis, is not the imitation of the objects of life, but of the energy of life itself, of bringing to life things. So the city is both things, a living creature and an artwork. And I would say that the city is not just a political fact. It's not at all a natural fact, because it has been created by man. But what is sure is that it is a poetic artifact, whereby poetic, I don't mean made by poets, but done by the poietai, so the artist in Greek, any artist. The Mediterranean city gave birth to philosophy, tragedy, comedy, poetry, art, and the art of speaking as well. So all writers and all artists should be responsible for the cities, because they generated the city of the Mediterranean. Not just the politicians, not just the people who inhabit the city, but the artists should be responsible for all our cities. How? By listening to the city, by writing and talking more and more about the fact that the city is not just a political fact. We cannot leave that to the politicians. We need to be able to create new myths, new narrations of the city, and to put them into the light that best challenge the idea of individuality, especially in the Mediterranean area, where we have those family ties among cities, the way we have family ties among people. So I keep on struggling onto that, and I hope that many writers will help me creating artistic, written, philosophical project about the idea of the Mediterranean city who doesn't have to forget her past. And I'm very happy because Paolo Barbaro, an Italian writer who wrote several books about Venice, and he's Venetian, wrote to me a letter after the book was released where he said, "The ungraspable and necessary city won't sink, I'm sure, if we all friends will talk about that also in the future." Thank you.